Yeah, so just to introduce myself, I'm Henry. This is Anj. We both work at A16Z. Anj is a general partner, invests in AI infrastructure companies. Anj has invested in a bunch of net new frontier AI labs in the last 5 years, notably Anthropic, 11 Labs, Luma, Sesame, Periodic Labs, and at Black Forest Labs, Mistral. And the conversation that we wanted to have is basically what does it mean to start a net new frontier AI lab in the 2020s? Why is it possible at all? And what lessons, as you learned from this, past experience of the labs, respecting that we are extremely short on time, I'm going to do a truncated version. Just starting off, I wanted to ask you, Anj. Dario called you when he was working at OpenAI. What did he say to you? What was that conversation like? What made you believe that something like Anthropic was possible?
Well, this is a technicality, but he had left OpenAI by then. I think they had decided that they wanted to leave and start something new. But I think the impetus for it was they had just finished training GPT-3. They said, Anj, we've trained this new model and we think it's going to change everything. I think there was an acknowledgement that it was going to take a lot of resources to do that. And I think they wanted some clarity on what it meant to go from being a research team inside of an existing lab to then taking that kernel and trying to build an entirely new business around that research. And so I had just sold my last company. I think the idea was that they felt like I knew a thing or two about what it would take to build a business like that. My previous company was around a bunch of computer vision research. So I did ask him, what do you think we need to get going? And he said, I think we can get by with 5. And I said, okay, well, as an angel, I'm an angel investor, I can send over 5 next week. And then he said, no, I don't think you understand what I'm saying. You're off by a couple of orders of magnitude. We need 500 million. So then that was when I think I sort of stepped back and realized things were going to be a bit different for the next few years. That was one of the reset moments for me when I realized the scale required to start a new effort needed a kind of thinking that was quite new.
And so, when we think about an AI lab today, they're in a genealogy with corporate labs of the past, things like Bell Labs, Xerox, PARC, come from large companies that have the ability to subsidize researchers to go pursue open-ended projects. Net new lab startups are different. Obviously, they are under different demands, but they're also starting from scratch. What had to be true in 2021 for something like Anthropic to be possible, both the nucleus of talent that existed, the ability to raise $500 million? Like, what was different in that moment? And I guess, what are those ingredients that have to go into creating a new lab?
To be clear, we were not able to raise 500 million. A few years before that, I had dropped out of grad school to work at a venture firm called Kleiner Perkins, and this was one of the great firms of the 90s and 2000s. They led the first round into Google and Amazon. And so I was like, okay, there are all these amazing firms up and down Sand Hill I can introduce you to. So I made 20 introductions for Dario and Tom, who were 2 of the co-founders of Anthropic at the time, and they got 21 no's. And so we were actually not able to raise, the plan A did not work, which is people didn't just write us a bunch of checks that we expected. And it was interesting, like the reason was not what I expected, because I thought, there's a whole venture capital industry whose job it is to fund big, bold bets. And so I thought what would be the pattern that would unfold would be that people would say, yeah, we totally get the whole AI thing. That's going to be a big thing, but maybe this is not the team to back. Or this is really not a business. There's no business model here to underwrite, and so on. Which was actually would have been a fair critique at the time, because at the time OpenAI was a nonprofit. This was pre-ChatGPT, and so there was no real breakout commercial plan, I would say, at the time. But really, the primary reason everybody passed is because they fundamentally didn't believe that AI was a thing. They lived through 3 or 4 different AI winters over the last 30, 40 years. So a number of the investors, especially who'd lived through the 2000s, were like, we've just seen this story before, Anj, and there's just no such, this whole scaling thing sounds like snake oil. And so that was quite a reset. We were able to scrounge together $100 million for the seed round, and it took a little bit longer than we expected. I think we started raising that in January, and it only ended in March. But notably, there were really no institutional investors in that first round. It was all angels, individuals who sort of sympathized with the mission and believed Actually, we're sort of close enough to the ground. Many folks who a couple I saw outside, who just had been following the ground sort of reality of what was happening with scaling laws, and were like, yes, of course, this is going to be a transformative revolution. But it really wasn't until like a year later that I would say Anthropic really raised its first institutional round. The first 3 rounds really ended up being a combination of angels, a couple of corporates who were compute providers. FTX famously was one investor in the Series A-ish. So we were not able to pull off both the scale of the original raise we wanted, or it did not end up being the construction that we expected. We're in a very different place today, but at least I would say some of those things continue to be true. When I especially truly new transformative frontier AI ideas today still get met with a level of skepticism by institutional investors that I'm shocked by, given how far along on the surface it looks like we are in frontier AI.
And so I think what's interesting about that is, I mean, obviously not hitting the original targets, still being able to put together the team that they were.
Right.
And I guess, the question that comes to mind for me is, in terms of making something like this possible, especially today, $100 million, you might give that to one person and not an entire company. What was true about that team then, and what has been true about the teams you've worked with since then, that they were willing to, first of all, walk away from what might be a large amount of money in order to do something that new? Why did they need to do something new? I think Anthropic, maybe it's a little better known, but in general, what is it that leads people to leave in the first place? So.
Oh, it's 100%. Like, I think the capital part of it. There were discussions about setting up Anthropic even as a nonprofit. We ended up setting it up as a public benefit corp. I think this should be well known at this point, that it's really the mission, right? There's this like, I think one of the most privileged things to be able to do in life is be consumed and obsessed by an idea you just can't get out of your mind. That's bigger than you, bigger than. It is a cause that you feel so compelled to pursue in your every bone of your body that you just can't wake up the next day and not work on that. And I think that there was a level of conviction in the early team at Anthropic that interpretability in particular was like, if you built a lab that was put interpretability first, because that would further the reliability of models and the safety levels of these models, that was a mission that they literally, like, once you have that clarity, I feel like every hour you spend not on that becomes like a thorn in your side. And I think that's the thing that compels people. It's not actually the money, it's not the valuations, it's not the value creation. In fact, a number of labs actually, for a long time, it looked like Anthropic would fail, right? Like, it just, for 2 years, it felt like the only thing that may have come out of it were like insights on how to make models more interpretable. They trained their first checkpoint before ChatGPT came out and gave it to a few thousand friends and family. It was the Claude 1. And it was not that different from the original ChatGPT 3.5 level of model, and they could have released that and been first to it. And they wasn't even I think it was a pretty short discussion that, no, we're not going to release this, because its intention was to be a petri dish for safety experimentation. So I find that like obsession with a mission where you just have, there's a cause you want to further is by far by orders of magnitude more important than anything else that compels people to start a new lab.
And there's something else that comes out of it that's kind of interesting, which is, today, Anthropic, and I think this is what's interesting about all these labs that are primarily researchers from the Genesis, suddenly they've just gotten actually kind of good at doing enterprise products. And I think there's some question, is Anthropic going to be creating agents for companies, enterprises, coding? I guess the question I have there is, for these companies to succeed or be self-sustaining, how is it that they make the transition from being researchers to shipping products? And then also, because that certainly, if you had, held Anthropic up to that standard on day one, it absolutely would have failed. But it turns out that they got there.
So an interesting reframing of what I'd tell you is not only have teams figured out how to get their AI solutions or models into what you'd call enterprise, or let's say large businesses, but enterprises have gotten better at understanding where the world is going. And that's always the hardest part with a new technology, is usually there's a small group of rebels who understand where the world is going, and they're scrappy, and it's the hero's journey where they all go on a mission together on the fellowship, and they discover this new magical thing that the rest of the world can benefit from. But then most of the resistance in enterprise land in the real world is change is just hard. And most large organizations actually don't know how to consume new technologies for a long, long, long time after they're discovered. And what's so extraordinary, I think, about what's happening in frontier AI is like, especially because of what's happened with reinforcement learning, where up until a couple of years ago, the big value from LLMs were in use cases or in situations where creativity was a feature, not a bug. Companionship, writing, talking. The idea of hallucinations was a feature because these models were more creative. But reliability was always really hard, especially in mission critical systems like in defense or aerospace or semiconductor manufacturing, wherever you need a couple nines of reliability. LLMs were miserable at delivering that predictability 3-4 years ago. That changed with RL, especially with custom RL, because you can when you can define the reward model concretely enough, RL is so good at driving the model's performance in a reliable way towards that outcome that they're now capable of solving a bunch of mission critical tasks in large businesses. And that's made businesses go, wait a minute, this isn't like the last 3 AI waves that promised a bunch of reliable automation and so on and didn't deliver. That's what's changed. They have become better at adopting and understanding how valuable the technology is. And that's actually, I don't think actually, like we just invest in a company called Periodic Labs. They're working on AI for science, like AI for physics and chemistry. We just announced publicly that the company is this is what the company is 2 weeks ago, and I've never seen this level of large sort of mission critical companies, Fortune 50 and so on, defense, aerospace, semiconductor folks reach out from the highest level saying we actually are ready to adopt this right now. It usually takes it's like pushing a boulder up a hill, and instead now the wave has it feels like a pull.
And Periodic Labs is about to be my next question. I think what is interesting to bring us up to today, 2025, where the white space is to actually create new labs doing things that fall outside of what the existing ecosystem is focused on. Where do you think RL for science and physical innovation? Maybe if you just describe what Periodic Labs is trying to accomplish, and also why is a mission like that uniquely capable of drawing talent in, drawing people in to work on it, versus a million other potential ideas.
Yeah, I think the short answer is back to my earlier question: reinforcement learning. RL for entirely new domains that AI has never really been able to address is working. And so the critical thing is wherever there's no RL loop running yet between a model predicting something and a verification of that prediction being true is where there's entirely new white space for RL. So in the case of Periodic, the 2 co-founders, Liam, who was the co-creator of ChatGPT, was running post-training at OpenAI, and Doge from DeepMind was running the quantum physics teams there, and they work in materials science discovery. And what they realized is LLMs had gotten so good at doing things at one half of the loop, which is reading all the literature of papers and so on around material science, but that the hard part was you need literally a physical wet lab to verify whether those materials are the properties that the LLMs are predicting were true or not. The first attempt at a lot of the frontier AI labs today was to try to do that through collaborations with academic labs or existing companies. But it turns out retrofitting this is a much slower path than just doing it end to end. Just owning the full process of taking a model, getting it to predict things in a new space, and then owning the physical verification loop of whether that prediction was right or wrong, there will be entirely new labs dedicated just to doing that in a fully vertical way. In any area that the current sort of paradigm of downloading the world's internet data and then doing pre-training does not naturally do verification. So code is a great example where I think the frontier labs, just the existing ones, OpenAI, Anthropic, and so on, just have a natural advantage, right? Because code is a subset of the pre-trained corpus online, but there's just almost no experimental data on material science in that corpus. And that's why you just need a team focused on that loop to make the kind of the same speed of progress on those tasks that you'd expect from the existing large labs on tasks they're good at.
And speaking of that team, do you see more people coming from outside of the AI ecosystem? I mean, coming from material science, PhD people, researchers from other fields, and is that a platform for new research, for new labs? Basically we need to take people who are leading their field and
Yes.
apply.
Yeah, that's a good question. So yes, I think we're in that step. If you study sort of previous eras of like fundamental technology shifts, like in the birth of the modern biotech industry, the wave one companies like Genentech were sort of pure, like largely concentrations of scientists in that one domain, right? They were mostly geneticists, or in the case of Herb Boyer, who was the chief scientist for Genentech, he was literally a professor at UCSF, and all the founding team were literally all his PhD students. The wave two of biotech companies came from folks actually from a commercial licensing background, who then took molecules that were being designed by scientists, and a lot of the innovation happened on process and distribution in entirely new verticals. Where if you're trying to build a business around drugs for cancer, whereas as opposed to drugs for diabetes, the kind of commercial processes you build, the kind of talent required to make that happen, are actually quite different. And that's where I think that we're in that phase of frontier AI, where in wave two, it's the combinatorial combination of a world-class ML team with a world-class team from the domain they're trying to attack using RL that ends up being the most, so the teams that are able to move fastest. So in the case of periodic, it's half machine learning folks and half physicists and chemists. And I think we will see similar like combinations of people bridging two different cultures for whatever industry they're trying to go after.
Yeah, and I think you could say also like the labs, like an Anthropic. I mean, at the very least, all you need is the talent, server time,
Right.
compute. Whereas now, maybe you need to build a lab. Maybe you need sensor data. Maybe you need domain knowledge. I mean, do you think that this means that it's less likely to come from the same places that the last set of labs have come from, exclusively from the existing big labs, or in the case of this, collaboration between someone coming from a big lab and someone coming from research?
I'll reason by example here. How many folks here have heard of a company called Sesame? Oh, okay, at least a few. Okay, so Sesame makes is a frontier lab or product team working on both training their own voice companion models as well as building a pair of AI glasses. And that team is composed of both folks who come from a few traditional labs with the ability to do model training, but actually most of the team came from a hardware background because they're building a pair of glasses. That team needs to understand all the intricacies of how do you do custom chip design that have nothing to do with frontier AI. But when you put all of those folks under one roof, the kinds of decisions they make are just completely different than if it was a team of primarily just alums from OpenAI, Anthropic, and so on. So I actually think some of the most exciting stuff is happening at teams who have almost no traditional experience in training models. And I think the reality is that this knowledge diffuses out really fast. One of the coolest things, the discoveries at Sesame, they had a research preview a few months ago, which has exceeded all expectations of their two voice companions, was that actually like approaching the models not as models, but as personalities that you would direct as if you were a Hollywood movie director. And that's really where a lot of the most biggest breakthroughs or leaps in their capabilities have come from, which is not really the lens you get inside of a traditionally bitter lesson build frontier model team.
Yeah, and actually, to that extent, I mean, how important is it to actually have users and to engage with them? I think of Google having a proto LLM with a chat interface that they didn't release because they were risk tolerance reasons. I was just talking with some people about world models the other day, and they were talking about, oh well, Google has Genie 3 but refuses to release it. How much does that matter? I mean, I guess the classic story for why these companies exist is, well, they had something. They were risk averse or slow to ship it, and by shipping, and maybe with image gen, I think it would be the classic example.
So the answer is it's super important in your 0 to 1 phase, and then it diminishes quickly. So with Midjourney, when I was running the platform org at Discord, and David was tinkering on the GANs, comparable out in the world was DALL-E 2's preview, and the only reason I think Midjourney really was able to leapfrog DALL-E for a while was the human preference data, where they put it on Discord, and for every generation that the Midjourney bot did, the users were given four images, and they could then rank which one of the 4 they wanted to upsample, and that signal turned out to be a really strong signal for which image they preferred. And we built the shim back to Midjourney. So Discord sent all of that human preference data back to Midjourney. And early on, even a few strong, they didn't need millions of people, but even having a few thousand strong signals on that taste and the aesthetic preference that opinionated early users of the model liked turned out to be extraordinarily important. And then like with scale, the more your users look like each other, the less valuable actually the preference data gets, because law of large numbers, the marginal new vote is not that useful. But when you want to take your system in a different direction from where it originally was in terms of quality, and you need a new distribution, then bootstrapping that distribution with more preference data becomes critical. So it's the answer becomes, to your question, how important is it to have users? Well, super important if you don't have any, and then increasingly less important if you already have enough of users in your current system that look like everybody else you want to serve.
And I think the question also, the quality of your early users is meaningful here. Like I had heard from someone at Meta, well, we have a problem with, fine tuning on Meta AI usage because people mostly hit the button by accident. And so the level of adverse selection in people's usage of the product is so high that we don't feel any confidence that we're getting signal from it.
Yeah. Thanks, folks.